It's week 14. All of the research, all of the hard work, all the studying is about to come to a close. Some of you might be starting your fantasy playoffs this week. Others may still be a week away from starting your playoffs. Whatever it may be, there is one thing that we're going to do this week. We're going to kiss. No, I'm not coming at you with these luscious puppies. I'm talking about keep it simple, stupid. And I will admit, there's nothing simple about 2025. It's been all over the place. And that's why, heading into week 14, we just need to look at the numbers, look at the trends, play our best players, and not get super cute with what we're doing in our lineup. But before we talk about all the matchups this week, we got to kick it off with our BRUNT Workhorse report. And we've got the top 24 running backs in terms of total volume so far this season. And Christian McCaffrey with 322 total touches, while Jonathan Taylor is at 261, is absolute insane work. Now, people are going to catch up to him because Christian McCaffrey is on a bye this week. But when you take a look at the players behind him, James Cook, Bijan Robinson, Devon Achane, all of these guys are top players in terms of fantasy. But then you look at Saquon Barkley, who hasn't really been able to do anything all season long, and he's still 6th in touches right now. Jahmyr Gibbs at number 8, you gotta wonder what his workload is going to look like over the next few weeks with Amon-Ra St. Brown and Sam Laporta set to miss time. And one thing that absolutely blows me away is J.K. Dobbins still being at number 22. That shows you just how much work he was getting at the beginning of the year. R.J. Harvey scored a couple of touchdowns last week, but he hasn't taken over as the workhorse. And just like some of these running backs are a true workhorse for our fantasy lineup, BRUNT is a true workhorse for us. High performance workwear for any job that gives you all day comfort, heavy duty durability, and made for any trade. And if you're interested in getting some workwear from BRUNT, use code HEADLINERS at checkout because you're gonna get $10 off your entire order and you're gonna get the ability to try it risk-free on the job site. So use the link down below, but don't forget to use code HEADLINERS at checkout and get yourself some high performance workwear regardless of what field you work in. Detroit's going to be on Thursday for the second straight week, and going up against Dallas, this matchup doesn't look nearly as good for Detroit as it maybe did a few weeks ago. Detroit might be allowing the fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, but Javonte Williams has been a true workhorse all season long. He isn't getting as many looks in the passing game as maybe as we would like, but that's okay. He's still doing a pretty decent job on the ground. And Detroit right now, they cannot cause any pressure. For whatever reason, they are struggling to get to the quarterback. And on the ground, they're not allowing a ton of fantasy points to running backs, but when you got a top 12 guy like Javonte Williams, at this point of the season, you're going to play him. Like I mentioned at the top of the show with Jahmyr Gibbs, what is his passing workload going to look like with Amon-Ra St. Brown more than likely missing this week and Sam Laporta done for the season? He's going to be a start because of his big playability. We have seen him rip off some huge runs this year, but you have to imagine that he's going to get a decent amount of work in the passing game with injuries to two of their top pass catchers. And for David Montgomery, I also think that he may get a check down here or there, which could help stabilize his floor, but you are banking on a touchdown this week. And Dallas's run defense has been a lot better, so the ceiling for David Montgomery isn't that great. I know Seattle's backfield has been a headache all season long, but down the stretch here, we're getting a little bit more value. Not a ton of ceiling, but the floor has not been awful. And both of these guys are fantasy viable. Kenneth Walker has at least 60 total yards over the last 4 games each. Zach Charbonnet has 8 touchdowns on the season, 3 of which has come in the last 4 games. So both of these guys are a fringe start. Kenneth Walker, a decent floor, but not a real high ceiling because of his total yards and his big playmaking ability. Zach Charbonnet, a decent floor, but not a great ceiling because he's not getting as much volume, but he does have a better chance at scoring. For Atlanta, Bijan Robinson is going to be a start, and maybe the ceiling is a little bit lower. This Seattle defense is allowing the 7th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. But we saw last week what this offense can do when it runs through Bijan Robinson. And with Kirk Cousins really not looking all that successful in his limited time this season, Bijan has to be the guy. And for Tyler Algier, if you want to put him as a fringe start, if you need an emergency flex play, you really have to hope for a touchdown. He has 4 touchdowns in 3 games and 8 total touchdowns on the season. Chase Brown is going to get a solid matchup going up against Buffalo this week, and Chase Brown has been way better as of recent than he was to begin the year. Buffalo right now is allowing the 4th most fantasy points per game, and Chase Brown has been a top 15 running back in 5 straight games. And you look at how often he's been at least a top 24 running back, you can extend that out to 7 games. He's been much better. He doesn't have the ceiling that he did last year, but his floor has been fairly good. If you drafted him, you finally feel a lot better using him. James Cook has been a big playmaker all season long, and he's coming off of a huge game as well. And now going up against Cincinnati, who still allow the most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, James Cook is in for a potential top 5 week. The one thing I have to say is, hopefully Buffalo doesn't make the same mistake Baltimore did last week. And we'll talk about that more in a second. Give the ball to James Cook and run the ball against this Cincinnati team. Tennessee's matchup against Cleveland is not great, and Tony Pollard looked a little bit more efficient last week than he has all season long. 60 rushing yards on only 10 carries, which is great. But in this matchup, from what we've seen from Tony Pollard and Tajay Spears all season long, I'll go ahead and stay away from them both. Again, let's keep it simple. It was good to see Judkins a little bit more efficient this week. 2 weeks ago, he did have 2 rushing touchdowns, but he only averaged 2.9 yards per carry. This past week, he got over 90 yards on the ground and averaged 4 yards per carry. In this matchup going up against Tennessee, this could definitely be one of those big weeks. If you have Quinshon Judkins and family, this is the stretch of games that we've been waiting for. Hopefully, he can help us seal the deal. The Washington backfield has largely been a mess, but Chris Rodriguez has kind of established himself as the low-key starter and the guy to own in this backfield. For Chris Rodriguez, he has 4 touchdowns in his last 6 games, and he's not giving us a ton of upside, but he is in a position right now that if you're dealing with maybe a bye for the first week of your playoff, injuries, whatever it may be, Chris Rodriguez is not the best option, but he could be an emergency flex option for you this week, and you gotta hope for a touchdown against Minnesota. I've got Aaron Jones marked as questionable right now, and we'll continue to hear a little bit more about the update on his injury throughout the week. If he's good to go, he's gonna be a start for me. Jordan Mason, as of right now, will be a fringe start. If Aaron Jones ends up starting and playing, I could leave Jordan Mason as a fringe start if you're hoping for a touchdown. Right now, Washington is allowing the 3rd most fantasy points per game. And one thing we've seen from Aaron Jones since his initial injury back at the beginning of the season, he continues to get banged up in the middle of games and has to come off the field. So Jordan Mason could score a touchdown this week, especially with how the quarterback play has been for Minnesota as of late. If for some reason Aaron Jones misses this week, Jordan Mason is no longer a fringe start. He might be a must start. Devon Achane may be the most consistent running back all season long for fantasy football. Yeah, more consistent than JT, more consistent than CMC. He hasn't had nearly the upside that those 2 guys have shown at times this season, but he's been the one guy that we've been able to trust to give us a really solid floor and a decent ceiling every single week. And in this matchup going up against the New York Jets, who are now allowing the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, Devon Achane is in a great position. In his last 5 games, Breece Hall has given us 4 top 24 performances. Over the last couple of weeks, he's been the RB16 each of those weeks. Before that, he was the RB6 and the RB3, with a pretty poor performance against New England right there in the middle of it, but he has played a whole lot better. And in this matchup, going up against Miami, I could see Breece Hall having another solid day. He doesn't give us the ceiling that we would like, but he's definitely given us a way better floor as of recent. Devin Neal didn't really do a whole lot from a fantasy perspective last week. Not really a high ceiling. His floor was okay, but he didn't help you win the week if you had to play him. In this matchup against Tampa Bay, who's currently allowing the 8th most fantasy points per game, Devin Neal could actually give us a solid RB2 day. The biggest thing about Devin Neal is that Taysom Hill wasn't really a factor last week. It was kind of odd a couple of weeks ago when Taysom Hill took over for Alvin Kamara and received more carries than what Devin Neal did. I didn't love that, and last week I thought that could end up being an issue for Devin Neal, but it doesn't look like it's going to be an issue moving forward. So for this week, he's definitely a fringe flex. And for Bucky Irving, This is really one of the reasons that 2025 has been so difficult. And NFL teams are getting worse and worse about this because throughout the week there were multiple reports that Bucky Irving was going to be limited, that Bucky Irving may only play 10 to 15 snaps. He may only end up playing 20 snaps. There was a couple of reports that verbatim said that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers were going to work Bucky Irving back the same way they did with Chris Godwin, which meant they were going to be slow with it and they were going to give him time to build back up. And guess what? That didn't happen. It was all a lie. And that's part of the reason why it is so difficult to try and figure out what is happening with injuries at the NFL level. But like I told everybody on Sunday, if you own Bucky Irving and you've been waiting this entire time and you feel good about it, then play him. You'll have to go with your gut because unfortunately, all the news we're getting spelt like a disaster. Bucky Irving ended up doing just fine though. Jonathan Taylor had a massive performance going up against Atlanta back in week 10 where he scored 48 fantasy points, half PPR, and was the RB1 and the top player overall. At that time, it was the most fantasy points that any player had scored in fantasy this season. But the games around that are a little bit of a cause of concern because around that game, he was the RB30, the RB26, and then last week, the RB29. And in that massive game against Atlanta, he had 3 rushing touchdowns. In those other 3 games I mentioned, he hasn't scored 1 time. This matchup going up against Jacksonville isn't necessarily the best matchup either. Jonathan Taylor owners, I know a lot of you would like to have a huge performance out of him this week, and I think it definitely is possible, because honestly the numbers could be a little misleading. Yes, they do allow the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs right now, but look at the teams they've played recently. The Tennessee Titans, the Arizona Cardinals, the Los Angeles Chargers, Houston Texans, Las Vegas Raiders. The last time they played a backfield with an actual proven stud that has given us consistent performances was probably against the Rams. And in that game, Kyren Williams only ran for 54 yards. So, what are we going to get from Jacksonville? Is their run defense really this elite? Can they shut down Jonathan Taylor this week? Let me know what you think down in the comments below. Or do you think that, no, they just haven't faced anyone like Jonathan Taylor at all, and that's why the numbers are a lot lower, and Jonathan Taylor is going to get back on the horse as a top 12 running back this week? Regardless of what you say down in the comments, though, you're going to start him. Everything was set up for Travis Etienne to have a really solid fantasy day last week, and he just couldn't get anything going. By Shell Tuin, he ended up finding the end zone after being a huge breakout candidate a couple of weeks ago and doing absolutely nothing. So for this backfield, I think we have to kind of continue to look at it in the same light that we were over the last few weeks. That Travis Etienne can hit a ceiling every once in a while, but realistically, you should be looking at a floor instead. And for Tuin, I don't think we should expect anything huge anytime soon. He's going to vulture some touchdowns here or there, but until we see 2, maybe 3 games in a row of specific fantasy related performance from him, I don't think that we can actually start him in our fantasy lineups, especially in the playoffs. Pittsburgh at Baltimore, and Jaylen Warren and Kenneth Gainwell are both fantasy relevant right now. Jaylen Warren has been the much better running back on the ground and continues to be the RB1. Kenneth Gainwell is getting some big plays on the ground, but it's work in the passing game that is really helping him out and making him fantasy viable. And this week, if we get no Aaron Rodgers once again, Mason Rudolph is sure to give Kenneth Gainwell a ton of targets. So for me this week, kind of the same thing I said last week. If Aaron Rodgers plays, both of these guys are a fringe start. Because going up against Baltimore, Baltimore's defense has played a lot better. Jaylen Warren could have a solid floor on the ground, give you 70 to 80 rushing yards. Kenneth Gainwell, though, if he has Mason Rudolph as a starting quarterback, he becomes a start. And him, with his groundwork and work through the air, could end up getting to 80 to 100 total yards. Pittsburgh is allowing the 8th fewest fantasy points per game this season, so Derrick Henry, for me, is getting a tougher matchup. But the more concerning thing is the absolute stupidity when it comes to their play calling last week. Because going up against Cincinnati on Thanksgiving night, Derrick Henry at the beginning of the game had a 22-yard touchdown run. He looked like he could be in for a big night going up against a defense that hasn't been able to stop opposing running backs all season long. And then for whatever reason, Baltimore decided, you know what, let's go ahead and throw the ball as many times as we possibly can with our banged up quarterback that hasn't been able to do much of anything over the last few weeks and completely abandon the run. Derrick Henry only got another 7 carries the rest of the game after that. RJ Harvey really saved his butt with a couple of touchdowns in last week's game, one of them coming very late. Had it not been for that touchdown, it would have been a really rough day for fantasy owners. And I gotta give a shout out to RJ Harvey, my son who is playing in a league with me for the first time ever. This is his first time ever doing fantasy football. With those 2 touchdowns from RJ Harvey, he locked up the #1 seed in our fantasy league. Shout out to Little Swag, his first time playing fantasy football, and he was able to get the first seed in his first year. That's really awesome, and RJ Harvey was a big part of that. RJ Harvey has not been great, not super efficient, and Jaleel McLaughlin is getting just enough touches to make us worry about RJ Harvey. In this matchup going up against Las Vegas, I think there's opportunity to score again, but we need to start seeing some bigger plays. And for Ashton Jeanty, he's going to have to be a fringe start this week. Denver's allowing the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game. This offense really hasn't been able to get anything going. They can't block for Ashton Jeanty. Really, he's going to need some passing game work this week. And if he can't get that, you're probably going to be disappointed in the performance that he gives you. Green Bay may be allowing the 10th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, but I'm still going to play DeAndre Swift and Kyle Monangai in any league that I have the opportunity to do so. They both are playing way too good right now to try and sit. DeAndre Swift is probably still the safer bet. He's going to be a guy that continues to probably be the RB1, while Kyle Monangai and his big playability on the ground is right behind him. But the touches and the time on the field are very close together. So right now, Kyle Monangai has a little bit of a higher ceiling than DeAndre Swift. I also think he has a better opportunity to score touchdowns than DeAndre Swift. While for Swift, I think he's still the RB1. He'll see a good amount of work on the ground, and maybe we can still get him some work in the passing game. We did not know if Josh Jacobs was going to be good to go last week, and he ended up being just fine and played well against the Detroit defense that has done a good job at stopping the run all season long. Josh Jacobs is in our lineup once again. Going up against Chicago, they haven't been great against the run. They haven't been awful either. Josh Jacobs, however, will have touchdown potential. The Arizona Cardinals are allowing the 9th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. And at this time, Kyren Williams and Blake Corum are both going to be fringe starts for me. It sounds like Kyren Williams left last week a little bit banged up. And while he was able to score a touchdown, Blake Corum stole the show. He looked much better. It does appear that Kyren Williams is going to be able to play this week, but will he be limited? That's going to be the question. Just because he plays doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to be 100%. And with the way Blake Corum ran the football last week, I would not be shocked if he continues to get about the same amount of carries as Kyren Williams. And if this isn't a true split backfield the rest of the way. We've still got a lot of question marks for the Arizona backfield, and I know Bam Knight looked solid last week, but this matchup is a little bit tougher. The LA Rams are allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Trey Benson could be back at any point in time, still officially on the IR, but his practice window is open, and he could return this week. Amari DeMercado, when does he return? Will he be good to go this week? He's still going to be questionable as of right now. And with those two things happening, Michael Carter definitely won't be fantasy viable, and will Bam Knight really still get enough work at the goal line to warrant starting? As of right now, it's really hard to play any of these running backs. Houston at Kansas City on Sunday Night Football, and this is not going to be an easy matchup for any of these running backs. Woody Marks last week saw the majority of touches, but Nick Chubb is the one that got the touchdown. This week going up against Kansas City, who allows the 6th fewest fantasy points per game, I would much rather look for other options to try and find a little bit more upside. And for Kansas City, this is a really tough matchup against a defense that's playing very well right now. And because of that, Kareem Hunt is going to be a fringe start. Last week with Isaiah Pacheco being back, Pacheco had no impact whatsoever. Kareem Hunt was still the guy, 15 carries last week. The only way that we play Kareem Hunt is if we think he scores a touchdown though. Monday Night Football, Saquon Barkley, what do you want me to tell you? He's a fringe start. He has to be. I mentioned it at the top of the video. He's a workhorse. He's getting tons of touches. And at any point in time, he could end up having a big play or a big game. We've seen it only a couple of times this season. But at this point in the year, do you have somebody to play over Saquon Barkley? If you have 2-3 running backs that you feel like present way more upside than Saquon Barkley, then you could roll with them. But if you don't, it's really hard to sit your number 1 overall pick. This Philadelphia defense could not stop Chicago's run last week to save their lives, and now they're allowing the 10th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. If Omarion Hampton returns this week, he is a fringe start just because of what does his workload look like, while Kamani Vidal will end up being a sit. If Omarion Hampton doesn't return this week, then Kamani Vidal turns into a must start. Headliner Nation, let me know down in the comments below. Do your playoffs start in week 14? If so, what bye do you have? If you still have another week to go before your playoffs start, have you clinched a spot? Are you still fighting for one? Give me an update on how your teams look down below. But before you get out of here, y'all gotta do me a favor. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, bell notifications on, become a member, hype the video, leave comments, whatever you can do right now to interact with the video would be greatly appreciated. Thanks so much, Headliner Nation. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.